use the onboard microphone. Test. Doesn't sound very good. It sounds like I'm in a bathroom. Test. Now it's working. Okay, sorry about that. For the benefit of time, I will do a quick recap. So, we are looking at Revelation chapter 4. Oops, let me go back. Good morning. This morning, we're going to look at Revelation chapter 4. And Revelation is this thick, rich text with multiple layers of meaning to it. And the letters to the 7 churches that we studied about last week in chapters 2 and 3 are very powerful. It promises that there's these great promises to those who will overcome. And then in chapter 1, this opening vision that John has of Jesus in chapter 1 is enough for those of us who seriously study the text to react like John reacts when we see this Holy One, and John himself falls down in awe and in worship. But now we realize that these first 3 chapters have only been a preparation for chapter 4, where the action really begins. And this is where John is given this revelation, this revealing that gives the book its title, the Revelation of John. And everything from this point on is part of the vision which is granted to John as he stands in the heavenly throne room. Let me repeat that. Everything in the book from this point on, everything from this point on is part of this vision which is given to John as he stands there in this heavenly throne room. And the idea, just the idea of a revelation or the revealing, just the idea of that and this book itself are based on this ancient Jewish belief that God's sphere of being and existence and operation that's called heaven commonly, and our sphere of being and existence and operation here on earth, that these 2 spheres are not separated by some great gulf. The ancient Jewish belief is that they meet and they merge and they meld into each other in lots of different ways. And for ancient Jews, the place where that happened most obviously was in the temple in Jerusalem. And I think this is important to understand as the action of this letter continues to be revealed to us. And so we as Christians believe that Jesus of Nazareth had become, in the flesh, in person, the place where heaven and earth met. God himself became man. And so when we look at him and we contemplate, we think about his death and resurrection especially, we believe we can see right into God's own world, that we can now understand things about his purpose which nobody had even imagined beforehand. That we can see that through Christ now. Let's remember this important term. We call the book the Revelation. The first word in the Greek, though, is apocalypso. And so this word apocalypse gives its name to the sort of writing that we're going to be reading this morning. And so it's like a mental switch that we need to turn on. Okay, I'm reading apocalyptic literature right now. I'm reading parts of Daniel, or I'm reading parts of Ezekiel, or I'm reading Revelation. This is a completely different type of literature. And so we need to remember that this book that we're reading here is both an apocalypse, that is a revealing, but John also says that it's a prophecy. And so we see in this chapter that John was in the Spirit. He was symbolically transported to heaven. And like any good apocalypse, something that reveals something that you can't see, John is going to recount his dreams for us. He's going to give us an account of those dreams and visions and symbols. Symbols like the number 7, right? The number is based on that 7-day Sabbath cycle in the Old Testament. And John is constantly using symbols like these from the Hebrew Scriptures. The 7, the number of completion, the number of the Sabbath, the completion of all of creation. And so John is constantly using these symbols, and he expects his readers to go and look them up and discover what those symbols mean. He doesn't ever give you the answer. Well, not always. Sometimes he gives you the answer to what these symbols are. But he expects us to go and look them up and discover the meaning for ourselves, like we did from Genesis this morning when we saw the 4 beasts. And these beasts are just crazy. They've got animal heads, and they've got the head of a wild animal, the lion, the head of a bird, the eagle, the head of an ox for livestock. And then we kind of look back at Genesis chapter 9, and we realize that God refers to the same animals as singing his praises over creation. So as we read through the rest of this book, we have to keep in mind this larger perspective that God is revealing his heavenly perspective on the events and the history that are happening on earth, on current events. Not 2020, 2021, or 2022 current events, but current events of the first century that are then reflected into current events of today. Now, that's the larger perspective of what's going on. And the reason John writes those things is so that the present reader, whoever that is, the first century person, or me and you, but especially those 7 churches, that they could read and they could view what was going on in light of the final outcome of history, of earth. We can see the final outcome of earth, and so yes, it is in the future, but this is not a manual of what is every event that is going to happen. So let's put that into practice this morning. Let us read this, and then let's understand and try and apply some of these things to our own day. Or let's see how they applied it, and then let's see how it applies to us. So the first thing that happens here in Revelation chapter 4, this is a very short opening here. I'm talking about the first verse and the second verse, and there's a lot happening here. There's a wealth of details about where John has been taken and what it all means here in these few verses. And here we have heaven and earth. And like we've been studying in Matthew maybe 6 months ago, and then in Isaiah after that, we find that heaven and earth are not separated by this great gulf. Our culture today sees heaven, or their version of heaven, as being so far away and removed, and this God that is so far away that he doesn't act in our daily lives anymore, right? That the problem is heaven, the only thing that heaven means is that heaven is God's sphere of reality. And that heaven is right here. Where's the door into heaven that John goes to? He doesn't go on a great journey to get to that door, right? He doesn't go through some wormhole to get to the door. It's right there in front of him, because heaven is right here with us. It's close beside us. It intersects with our ordinary reality in ways that we don't always perceive. It's not a door in the sky necessarily that's far away. It's more like a door opening right in front of us, where before we could only see this room that we're in. We could only see the streets of the city around us, right? And suddenly there's an opening leading to a different world, an invitation to come up and to see what is really going on in the world that you're living in already. just peeking around the curtain. And so this is not anything to do with God's people being snatched away. We already mentioned that during the class this morning. This has nothing to do with dispensationalism. This has nothing to do with a rapture. This is John being taken up for a vision. This is not some crazy doctrine that's false. Especially Jewish apocalyptic literature communicated through symbols, through symbolic imagery, and through numbers. And it's not a secret predictive code about the timing of the end of the world. This is not what they were trying to communicate. This is about a prophet who's being taken into God's throne room so that he can see behind that curtain and understand both what is taking place now during his time and how it all fits together and makes sense in light of the end of the story that we find in Revelation chapter 21 and 22. Now, chapters 4, 5, and 6 are going to, 4 and the first half of 5. Chapters 4 and the first half of 5 are going to start to introduce now a whole series of events and a series of sequences, let me put it that way. It's going to introduce a sequence of prophecies that are going to take us throughout the rest of this book. Chapters 4 and 5 are also going to introduce the first of the recurring or reoccurring sequences and prophecies in the book. The first one is going to be the 7 seals, which have to be broken in order for John to be able to see what is on this scroll. We know the scroll is the scroll of God's purpose. That's what he says it is in chapter 5, verse 1. And in order for, you got to think about it, this is a picture John is drawing us of a scroll that has 7 seals on it that are all sealing. And so all of those seals have to be broken in order for the scroll to be unrolled. That's how scrolls work. When we get there, there's going to be a little bit of deviation from that, but that's the idea. So that's what's going on here in chapters 4 and 5. But by the time John is writing this scroll, let's think about the context now. By the time John is writing this scroll, the persecution of Nero has already passed. But the persecution of the Emperor Domitian was just beginning. Now, I'm taking the view that is says that Revelation was written about 95 AD. Many people take the view that it was written before 70 AD and that all of these events are about the destruction of Rome. I would disagree with that, but that's just where I'm coming from. Now, if John is writing this scroll and the persecution of Nero has passed, but the persecution of Domitian was just beginning, then we could see how these tribulations and how the people who are going to die are still going to happen. And so the temptation for these 7 churches then would be to deny Jesus in order to to avoid this persecution. Or if we deny Jesus, we could become part of the Roman system, which has a lot of wealth to offer, a lot of ill-gotten wealth, right? Because the Rome, as we're going to find out later, is portrayed as trading in bodies, in slavery, and in stolen goods, that they have gone and conquered these people and stolen their possessions. But Jesus is going to call them to something opposite of that. He's going to call them to faithfulness, and he's going to call them to faithfulness with a promise of a reward for all of those people who overcome evil through reliance on himself, on Jesus. And so the driving tension in the book of Revelation, pulling one way and pulling this way, is this. The question is, will Jesus' people endure to the end? Will they inherit the new world of chapter 21 and 22? And why is this faithfulness described as conquering? From the letters of chapters 2 and 3. Why is this faithfulness called conquering if we're not actually supposed to go out and kill people? That's conquering, right? Well, the rest of this book, the rest of the book here of Revelation is John's answer to those questions. And John's first answer is going to come here in chapter 4 in the form of a vision of the heavenly throne room with this imagery that is drawn from many of the prophets. We talked about Daniel and Ezekiel and Isaiah and several others, Micah and a few others. What we're seeing here in chapter 4 and 5 is not the final stage of God's plan, though. This is not a vision of the ultimate heaven as the final resting place of God's people who die and go to heaven somehow. That's not the picture we get when we read Revelation, unfortunately. This vision is the entrance of John into heaven as it is right now. John is not seeing the end of time, what heaven is going to look like. That's not what he's seeing. He's seeing what is going on right now in heaven. This scene in this heavenly throne room is a current reality. It's a current reality. It's a present reality for John, but it's also a present reality for us. And so John's vision of what must take place after this, it says, is not the end of the world as we know it, which is what a lot of people hear when they hear apocalypse and Revelation. These are the terrible events that are going to engulf the world and cause all the suffering of God's people that the 7 churches have just been warned about. And so this scene initially here in Revelation chapter 4 reminds us of Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel, Daniel. Ezekiel chapter 1, where Ezekiel he's given this vision. Remember, he's already in captivity. It says he's by the river Chebar among the exiles. Ezekiel chapter 1 says, and the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God, he says in chapter 1, verse 1. And Ezekiel's given this vision of God's throne chariot thing that is on spinning wheels that are on all sides, like he's going in circles or something. I'm not sure. Well, those wheels symbolize the fact that he's able to move in any direction. And these wheels are fiery wheels. And there's a rainbow, it says in Revelation chapter 4 and verse 3. Around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of emerald. There's also that sort of a picture there in Ezekiel, but it also takes us back to that story of Noah, right? In Genesis chapter 9, we made this very profound realization this morning during class about the rainbow and about Genesis, where in Genesis chapter 9 we have this great bow that's put into the sky that we call a rainbow in the sky. That was God's visible promise of mercy to never again destroy the earth with a flood. A rainbow looking like an emerald is supposed to challenge your imagination, because rainbows have lots of colors, right? But emeralds are a single color. It's supposed to challenge your imagination. Not only a challenge in these chapters here of Revelation, but the effect on us is this rich and dense combination of the original meaning of that rainbow of mercy and awe and beauty all into one that are now overwhelming John as he sees these things in heaven. And surrounding the throne of God are creatures and elders who are giving honor and allegiance or promising their loyalty. We call that faith to God. And they're giving praise to God. And they say things like, holy, holy, holy is God. This is verse 8. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And so John is seeing the council that is around God. There's now more than just God himself here. There are created spiritual beings around God. And this is not the first time we have seen this. If we look through the scriptures and we actually have an open mind, we will see in Deuteronomy chapter 32, in Psalm 81, in Psalm 1, in Psalm various other ones, we see other spiritual beings that are called Elohim, the same word we use for God, that surround the one true God. And so now we can see that even in the Old Testament, they had glimpses of what John saw, that there is this divine council around God of other spiritual beings. And in this case, John sees 24 elders sitting on separate thrones all the way around God's throne. And they represent the combination of the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles. They are the embodied perfection of the people, all of the people of God for all time. And those people now share in the rule of God over the world, right? Their robes are white that represent this purity and this victory. And their crowns, they're wearing these crowns that reveal them as representatives that are royal. They are a part of the priesthood. If we look back at chapter 1 and verse 6, and then chapter 5 next week in verse 10, and then at the end of the book, we'll see them again in chapter 20 and verse 6, where these are representatives of God's royal priesthood, which we then find out is the church, that we then are part of his kingdom, that we co-rule with Christ in his kingdom, that we then also have a crown waiting for us. And so what does this mean for us? What does the first half of chapter 4 mean for us? Right? We've seen God's throne in heaven, and John's has appeared before that throne like Daniel, like Ezekiel, like Isaiah. But the idea of a throne room, just the idea of a throne room, with someone sitting on the throne who is surrounded by these advisors, right, should instantly remind the reader of a very different court. Now, we don't live under a monarchy, but who do we think of when we think of the most powerful person in our country? The president. And who does he surround himself with? Advisors. John's readers would imagine Caesar and his council that surrounded him. And already we can hear the undertones of a power struggle. John is strongly implying here that we are being invited to see that the powers of this world are simply parodies. They are copies, cheap imitations, knockoffs of the one power who really and truly rules in heaven and on earth. And as John's great vision continues to be opened to us, we will see how these human kingdoms have acquired their wicked and cruel power, and how God's power is radically different, and how his power will win over the victory over those wicked and cruel kingdoms. This is the victory here that we looked at last week in chapter 2 and 3, that the 7 letters to the 7 churches were urging those churches to participate in. Become a victor with us. And that victory is not through just trying harder, it's through Christ's blood. We don't see that till next chapter, so I won't get too far into it. But in chapter 5, we see this lamb. John is told that the Lion of the tribe of Judah is worthy to open the scroll. He turns to watch him do it, and he sees a lamb that's been killed. Neck probably cut open, but he's bloody. The problem is this lamb is still standing up. It's an intentional vision that is very dissonant. Why is it that way? It's designed to make us ask why. Why is it that way? It's because God's power, God's radical power, God's power is radically different and will win over evil in a different way. And that is the victory that those churches are being invited to take part in. It begins with the unveiling of reality here on earth, though. This door that John is going through is not a physical door. Behind the complex and messy confusion of the ancient life in what we call today Western Turkey, or in Sitka, Alaska, behind all of that, behind the challenges of the fake synagogues in the 7 churches, or behind the false teachers here in Sitka, or behind atheists, or the threatening rulers that threaten us if we come and worship. Behind those struggles and difficulties of ordinary Christians, there stands a heavenly throne, and a heavenly throne room in which the world's creator remains a sovereign and a king. And it's only by it's only by stopping in our tracks, just completely stopping and thinking about this vision that John had, that we can then have a little glimpse of, that we can just kind of peek into a reality that not only makes sense of our own lives, but it also enables us to win that victory. All right, let's look at the second half of chapter 4. Second half of chapter 4. Now, John sees something like the sea of glass that is in front of this throne. I'm going to tell you right now, every commentator has a different idea about what this sea is, so don't get too hung up on it. But there's a sea of glass in front of the throne. I want to focus on one word here, though, and that word is the sea. And its location being in front of the throne. Being in front of the throne means that it's under God's direct control. This is like I said, it's mysterious, but in chapter 15, if we look at the word sea throughout the rest of this book, in chapter 15, verse 2, we see that the sea of glass has become more like the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, depends on how you want to translate that. And that sea is the one that the children of Israel have passed through to reach safety. The other sea that we can see is in chapter 13, and just like in Daniel 7, this great beast comes up out of the sea. But remember, the sea is right in front of God. He's in control of the sea, but this beast emerges from this. This great beast comes out of it. But watching on the shoreline in chapter 13 is the dragon who's commanding, apparently, this beast to come up out of the sea in chapter 12. And of course, at the end of the story, we see the New Jerusalem itself coming down out of heaven, and there is no longer any sea. There is no... Elizabeth, you need to be quiet. That there is no longer any sea in this New Jerusalem, right? So this beast can no longer come up out of the sea because there is no sea anymore. And all of this is showing us that the sea within this throne room is a symbolic representation of the fact that within God's world, as it currently is right now, within his world, evil is present. And it's dangerous. But it's going to be contained within God's purposes. We won't always understand that, and we won't always like it, because evil is most likely going to affect us in some way. There is evil going on right now. Take, for example, in the war in Ukraine. There are people being tortured and killed because of the evil of what's going on there. But God is saying that all of that will eventually be overthrown. And that's where we can have our hope. And so on to the four creatures now. So there's four creatures, and these four creatures seem to, in some way, represent or resemble, I should say, not represent, the seraphim who surround God in Isaiah's vision in Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah sees the heavenly temple, he calls it, in chapter 6. And there's also four creatures in Ezekiel chapter 1. And if we look at these creatures, they represent all of creation. They represent the animal creation, including humans at this stage, but with just a human-like figure who's simply one among this other creation. He's not distinguished yet. The other three, so one of them has a human face. The other three is, there's a lion who's quite commonly called the king of the wild beasts, right? There's the massive leader of the tamed animals or the livestock. That would be the oxen or the ox. And then there's the undisputed king of the air, right, which is the eagle. And twice John tells us that they are full of eyes. They are never sleeping. They keep watch over God and over all of his creation. They also praise God constantly. So all of God's creation is supposed to be, by its nature, should be praising him. And so the contrast between the four creatures and the 24 elders is even more striking, though. Creation as a whole, these animal types, they simply worship God. But the humans who represent God's people understand why they do it. And so these elders, they say, you deserve to receive glory and honor and power because you created these things. And so there's a recognition of God's place and his role in creation now. And so worship is what we are made for. And this scene here in chapter 4, what we see is the foundation for everything that is going to come to follow after this in the book. Everything that is so powerful and so disturbing in this book flows out of this scene right here. And so there's some profound problems within creation, or let me just say, because of the existence of profound problems within creation, means that the Creator must act to decisively put those things right. He doesn't act because creation is bad and he's angry with it. That's the God you get out of popular Christianity, right? This angry God who's just ready to take them out because they have messed up, right? That's not the picture we get here. The picture we get here is that creation is good. God will act because he created a good creation. And he's angry with the forces of evil who have destroyed and defaced that creation, which threaten to completely destroy it. Let me back up. He's angry with the forces of evil who have corrupted and defaced his creation. And those same forces are threatening to destroy his creation. That's chapter 11, towards the middle of the chapter. Let me look real quick. Chapter 11. In verse 18, the nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and for rewarding your servants and the prophets and the saints, and for those who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth. If you corrupt God's creation, if you try to destroy it, God will judge you. And so John's vision is not that he sees this heavenly dimension, this heavenly sphere, as just reflecting what is going on in the life of the church. This is not just what's going on in the life of the church, but he sees in heaven what ought to be going on in the church. He sees a reflection of the way it should be. So what's the meaning then for us? I think there's so much that we can learn about worship, especially in our tradition that has very clear roots of descending from knee-jerk reactions, and very rightly and justly said that that is wrong. And we've run so far the other way away from it so as to not be associated with it that we've gone beyond Scripture in some places. For example, we don't often have what we would call a liturgical service, where we do a lot of reading the entire service. We don't have services where we sing nothing but the Scriptures. We don't do these things that the first church did because other denominations do that, and we don't want to look like those denominations. What I'm trying to say is that's the wrong idea. We've run so far the other way that now we're losing something of what's going on here. So I think we need to pause and reflect on the worship here of these creatures and try to be like those things. So let me ask some questions. Do we, in our own private prayers, in our own worship, and even in our public worship service, do we give enough weight to praising God as the creator of all things? Do we just thank him for what we have and ask him for more? Do we allow these ancient poems, like the song of Daniel's friends while they're in the burning room, or the king who's lost a child in the Psalms? Do we let those things form our praises to God so that we can consciously celebrate with those different elements of creation? Do we see the animals around us as singing God's praise, or do we see them as a commodity to be exploited? That goes for the same thing for the rest of his creation. Do we see the earth as something glorious that he has created for our benefit, or do we see it as something to be exploited to the greatest possible extent, and when we're done with it, we just throw it out? We're just done with it. Do we view creation itself as this theater that is doing nothing but praising God? If we can think of a theater, it's often semicircular or around a stage. Do we see that as singing God's praise to the God who's on the throne in the middle of that stage? Do we treat his creation that way? Or is it only something to be consumed and thrown in the trash once it's used up? Do we think through the fact that God deserves glory and honor and power because of what he's done for us? You know, we often think that, oh, well, that's obvious, right? That's obvious. Well, it's actually anything but obvious, because the world has, since time immemorial, has been full of systems and philosophies and religions that have ignored creation and especially seen creation as dishonorable. And there's a certain view of Christianity today that sees creation as dishonorable, that we as humans are nothing but evil inside. We are not created that way. That was not our intention. We were created, and God saw what he had created and called it good. We have chosen to do evil things, but we were not evil from birth. Revelation sets out a picture for us. It paints a picture for us that it's delicate. It's also decisive, though, in its balance. That all of creation worships God, and we as humans are called to worship him with our mind, but as well as our heart. We need to recognize that he is worthy of all praise as the creator of all things. And so, in closing, another 30 minutes, no. To kind of bring the picture together here, God is revealing his heavenly perspective on history and the current events that are going on, so that the reader, John's readers, or us, any time or place, so that the reader of Revelation could view these symbols in light of the outcome at the end of the book. At the end of history and the final outcome, we could see the symbols and what they mean. And so we've already had the 7 letters to the 7 churches, and now we're introduced to 7 seals in chapter 5. And these 7 seals are opened between chapter 6 and verse 1 and chapter 8 and verse 1. And the 7th seal introduces a further sequence of 7s. Again, 7 trumpets, which are blown one by one from chapter 8 to chapter 11. Then at the very center of the book, in the last half of chapter 11 and in chapter 12, we find visions which unveil the ultimate source of the evil, that dragon and that beast that comes up out of the sea, and the beast from the land. And also there's this vision of those who have somehow defeated those monsters in chapters 12 through 15. That then leads into another sequence of 7. That is the 7 bowls of wrath. That is the final plagues that are like the plagues of Egypt in chapter 15. And these plagues are going to be the means of judging the great tyrannical power of the beast. And these bowls are going to be the means of rescue for God's people out of the claws of that beast. And so these bowls of wrath are poured out from chapter 16 into 17 and 18. We see the effects of those things. Elizabeth, you need to be quiet. Whisper. Okay? The bowls of wrath are poured out there from 16, 17, and 18. And they lead into the celebration of victory over the 2 beasts in chapter 19. And that only leaves one opponent left, the one who called those beasts. That's the dragon himself. And the last twist in the story the story of his fate of the dragon is described in chapter 20, where we see a rider coming on a white horse to do battle with this beast, this dragon, but he's already bloody. And the sword isn't in his hand, it's in his mouth. And the blood is not the blood of the dragon or the blood of the people he's defeated. It's his own blood. And the sword is in his mouth. And that somehow clears the stage when this rider comes and defeats that beast for the final unveiling of God's eventual plan. That is, the new Jerusalem coming down from the new heavens and the new earth that are fully joined forever. And that's the story that we find in Revelation, and that needs to be the basis for our faith, that we see the Creator God, that He is the one who inspires us to have faith in Him, because He promises for us to overcome the evil of this world, not by living till we're 99, not by living forever in this life, but that He promises us a life eternal with Him in the new heavens and the new earth. And that's the lesson for this morning from Revelation chapter 4. If anyone needs to make that commitment to Christ, we can help you with that. If anyone needs to recommit themselves to Christ and give Him their allegiance, to give them their faith, to give Him their faith, we can help you with that this morning. Please contact us if you're listening online, sitkachurch@gmail.com, or just come by the building here in Sitka and we can help you with that. Have a good morning, everyone.